Good morning and welcome to our live stream. I've kind of lost count of how many we've done at this point, but I'm Shimon and this is Matthew, and together we wrote a book called I Do Not Think That Word Means What You Think It Means. We wrote it because we tend to disagree on a lot of political stuff, kind of all the way back to many times first principles, but yet we managed to still have many good, open, and honest conversations over the years. And keep that discourse open. And we believe very strongly that that discourse is sorely lacking in today's society and part of what's tearing the world apart. So we tend to listen to each other and take the best possible view of whatever the other person has to say and not assume that they're the devil or the enemy or any of those bad things, and try to maintain a good, solid discourse. With that, we'll jump right into it. Today, we posted an article from The Guardian. It's an opinion piece by Robert Reich, and it's Don't Believe the Anti-Trump Hype, Corporate Sedition Still Endangers America. And Matthew, you brought this to the table, so I'm going to give you a moment to kind of give a little synopsis and kind of what you think, what you thought about, and where your mind went when you saw this.
Well, it's calling attention. Robert Reich, I guess, was Secretary of Labor under Clinton, and he's always had a deep suspicion of the power of corporations in America and how much, especially since Citizens United, corporations have basically expanded their almost extra democratic powers over the American government, over what's on or off the table, over how much subsidies, protections, de facto insurance they get. And in some ways, this always was a bigger story than, the specific politicians we have. Even with someone as much of an outlier as Trump, I think the amount of daylight between the two political parties in terms of how they treat corporations has been pretty small. So, there's a lot I could say about the article, and I don't necessarily agree with all of it, but I do agree with sort of the bigger thing it's calling our attention to, which is corporations have become much more powerful than they used to be with respect to, compared to the power of, say, the American voters. And he illustrates that with he says the second that the Democrats officially had won the Senate, that's the moment that the Silicon Valley corporations decided to use their power to shut down Trump himself, shut the accounts of, depending on how you measure it, hundreds or thousands or even millions of conservatives, if you want to count shutting down the Parler platform. And they also announced that they are going to, quote, examine the possibility of no longer donating. Several corporations declared that they're no longer going to donate to the 147 Republican congressmen and senators who expressed any amount of support for Trump's election lawsuits and challenges. So it should be, I think, if you're looking at this as an outside observer, pretty alarming, the exercise of corporate power going on right now. And because of that, I was attracted to this article. But it's not clear to me what's really happening, but I am deeply concerned. And it's funny because the Bernie wing of the party of the Democrats has always sort of agreed with this, that corporations are too powerful. And I think Robert Reich is in that direction. But there's plenty of people on the right now, especially in the wake of Facebook and Twitter and everything, feeling like corporations have too much power as well. So that's an interesting moment in time that we're living through.
Yeah, I don't know that, in my experience anyway, that the right has typically been a kind of pro-corporation. Their policies tend to benefit corporations, but I don't know that if you went and polled kind of people on the right and or even Republican politicians, that they would think that corporations needed more power. I certainly wholeheartedly agree with you that corporations have way too much power in America. And to some extent, I applaud Robert Reich for kind of standing up and calling that out, even though at the moment that power seems to be bending in his direction. There was a lot of other cynical rhetoric in the article that I could have dealt without, and I actually had to stop reading the first time because it was just kind of made me a little nauseated to just try to read it. But when I finally got through and kind of got to the bottom of his idea, I thought that he had some good points. Definitely, corporations have too much power, and unfortunately, we keep looking for more power, or at least the current people in power are looking for corporations to exercise more power. The amount of applause that I saw when Twitter decided to toss Donald Trump off their platform, it was just astounding. I mean, you can agree with somebody or disagree with somebody, but to say that they don't have a right to be on a platform, and I was listening on the radio the other day, and the commentator was making this point. It's like the supreme leader of Iran is on Twitter and regularly calls for the complete destruction of what he calls the Zionist entity or the state of Israel, where 9 million people live, including 2 million Muslims. And I mean, they literally were trying to have a nuclear program to wipe that country off of the planet. And that guy, he's allowed on Twitter, but Donald Trump somehow just too dangerous. So, I mean, it's kind of a bit of a kind of a crazy wackadoo double standard.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you believe the hysterical, well, that's not fair. That's a loaded word. If you believe the version that some Democratic senator, actually even a few Republicans, the Capitol, the thing that happened at the Capitol, I'm going to try to not use the loaded words about it, but if you agree with the view of it, which some senators and congressmen who were there felt, that it was an insurrection, that it was an actual attempt to overthrow the United States government that was, invited by the outgoing president to avoid losing power. If you believe that version, which I would say has a kernel of truth, I don't believe it's actually true, but it has a kernel of truth. If you believe that's true, then, actually taking at least a temporary measure to take Trump off of those platforms, it recalls to me like in 1988 or not, when the Soviet, bloc was falling apart. I think in Romania, when Ceausescu was overthrown, the first thing that the protesters did was they all went to the television station buildings and took over the television stations and started broadcasting that Ceausescu was no longer in control. And it was deeply symbolic of Ceausescu actually no longer being in control, controlling the mouthpiece. Now, of course, those were communist countries, so there was only kind of one mouthpiece. I think in Rwanda, the genocide that happened there happened mostly because of the radio stations. For months, they were sort of whipping up hysteria on the radio stations. And then at a certain point, they said, okay, it's time to kill all the Hutus. And everybody listened on the radio, and then they went out with machetes and killed an awful lot of the Hutus. So there's an argument to be made, again, if you believe that the people doing the insurrection, so to speak, were a genuine danger to the existence of America, that you would take that these would be the least of the measures you would take. And in that sense, you would say that, Facebook, Twitter, Google are just being responsible, citizens to help, hey, what can I do of service? Kind of like all the news agencies did in World War II. I don't agree with that argument, but I'm trying to strongman it here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to stray too deep into the discussion of kind of the Capitol, although I think that in a lot of ways, I've seen a lot of comparison, typically from the right, about this being a kind of a Reichstag fire, and kind of the historical context of that. And I'm not going to go so far as to say that this was kind of incited by the left, but it's certainly being used by the left as a way to kind of clean house, essentially. It's being used to kind of completely paint anybody who doesn't agree with them or thought about voting for Trump, which is 75 million Americans, as being hopelessly evil and all having participated somehow in that Capitol riot, when there are a few dozen people that were look, there definitely seems to be evidence that there were people that were there to literally try to incite an insurrection, um, capture the vice president, and there's all kinds of crazy stuff coming out. That there were groups of people that were trying to do that, and those people are obviously criminals and should be prosecuted. Terrorists, possibly, certainly, possibly insurrectionists. Call them what you will, and those people should be deserve to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And what's nice to see is I have not seen not one person from the Republican side that has not condemned the violence. Meaning they're all uniformly and unanimously condemning violence, and they've been fairly consistent in that because those same people have been out calling for the last 6 months or so for their counterparts to condemn violence, and yet here condemn the violence that's been going on in cities all across America for months. And while these two events are not equivalent in any way, shape, or form, they do both revolve around violence, and that violence, it's kind of weird to watch the people that kind of hushed up violence for 6 months and kind of aided and abetted it. I mean, Kamala Harris set up a bail fund for protesters, which means rioters, because mostly protesters don't get arrested. And yet, on the other side, the Republicans have unanimously denounced and decried violence forever. And now they're getting painted with this very broad brush of, well, you stood with Donald Trump, or you thought maybe there's some irregularities in the election, so therefore you must be evil and you're responsible for this Capitol riot. And there's a huge double standard being employed there, but I don't think that's actually what we're here to talk about, although you're welcome to respond to what I just said.
No, I agree that it gives us a lens in to a bigger dynamic, which is kind of where are the corporations with respect to all of this? And one of the other things that he mentions in this article is this is the first election probably since the foundation of the Republican Party in, I think, 1854. I'm not sure. The first election where the Democrats got more corporate money and more Wall Street money than the Democrats, I think, by an order of magnitude. Since the Clintons, there's been at least something more like a 40-60 split, but I think this is the first one where it was really way over the top. And now they're actively talking about, cutting off all donations to any congressman or senator, any Republican congressman or senator, not that supported the so-called insurrection, but that even gave indications of support to Trump's legal challenges. So it's a chilling sort of thing. I mean, look, there's been a couple points in American history where one party has fallen out of favor or completely fallen out of power. In the 30s, I think Democrats held well over 80% of the House of Representatives, and Roosevelt won elections by these giant landslides, and there barely was a Republican Party, except for the so-called Progressive Republican Party that existed in Wisconsin, which was way to the left of even today's Democratic Party. So there's been periods where one party fell out of favor, and there's certainly, given the gap between Trump and Trumpy people, and that's one so-called faction of the Republicans today. And then there's like the Koch brothers, Tea Party, more libertarian leaning part of the Republican Party. And I think those two factions are probably more enemies of each other than either is with the Democrats in some respects. So I don't know what's happening right now with the Republican Party. And again, that's a digression. I think the point of this article was, hey, we're all getting distracted with this partisanship and all this Trump stuff. Meanwhile, the corporations have become dramatically more powerful. And because it's disguised as a partisan thing, we're almost not noticing that this whole Facebook, Twitter, and money cutoff thing is this tremendous exercise of corporate power that's it should be far more scary and significant to us than it has been. I think that was kind of where the article was going.
Yeah, that's certainly where the article is going. I'm not sure that the evidence 100% kind of bears out that notion. Although it might not be, it's not necessarily a raw dollars phenomenon. I'm going to post the link actually to all of our people that are watching or paying attention, which I think right now isn't very many, but that's fine. They may come back to it later. It's to Open Secrets, which kind of goes cycle by cycle on who gave what to whom. It's not very great or granular data. It's kind of very aggregate. And what I think what you see is that in 2016, 2018, 2020, all of the interests actually supported Democrats handily over Republicans across all the categories. And they break it down as far as business driven, labor driven, ideological driven, and they have this other category which isn't very well developed for a place called Open Secrets. But I'm sure you can dig deeper into it if you wanted to. And I kind of went back and flipped through the last couple of cycles. And I found it very interesting that in like 2014, that they skewed heavily towards Republicans. And my guess is that corporations are going to kind of support their own interests, right? Obviously, all the time, and they're going to try to find politicians that are going to support whatever interests them. And I think they have a right to, and I think they should have a right to, just like labor unions have a right to advocate on their behalf, and voters need to educate themselves. I once heard Dan Crenshaw say, and I thought it was very kind of interesting, and I'm going to mangle this quote, but he basically said, if you want money out of politics, then the American people need to start paying attention, because the only reason we need money is so we can break through whatever else you're doing in your life and get your attention for a few minutes to try to pay attention to what your government is doing.
Yeah, that's fair. I wonder how much, part of the downside of Citizens United is that even the most well-meaning legislators, the ones that genuinely seem to be willing to say uncomfortable things that even make them uncomfortable with their own party leadership, and maybe even risk some of their viability to be donated to by all these corporations. So, Dan Crenshaw, Tulsi Gabbard, Bernie Sanders, these kinds of people who were willing to say things that made certain donors less likely to donate to them. Even those kinds of, so to speak, mavericks are still spending a huge amount of their time and effort positioning themselves in such a way, or voting in such a way, that they ensure continuing donations in order to stay in office. And since Citizens United, that's if you just measure the amount of time of every one of our elected officials, that's the number one amount of time and effort that they all do, is raising money for re-election. So that's, like you said, like I don't know that I would disagree that corporations have a right to advocate for themselves, but I'm still horrified by Citizens United. I still think that corporations have plenty of means to get their own narratives out there, and they have these incredibly powerful ad campaigns. They pay for Super Bowl ads. They pay for, they put their names on stadiums. They put their names on all sorts of things. They shape the discourse. They support think tanks. They have 100 things they can do other than donating to political campaigns. I don't think they need to also have the right to donate to political campaigns, because it's produced a world where, in a sense, I don't know if we can trust any of our elected officials to be non-bought and paid for by somebody else.
Correct, somebody. But so here's the interesting thing, right? Even if you look at these statistics in Open Secrets, right? It says that 5 points in 2019, 2020 combined, and basically the entire lead up to this election cycle, business contributed $5.6 billion to political campaigns. 2.3 billion of the 2.4 billion of those dollars went to Democrats, and 1.8 billion went to Republicans. But that's not the interesting thing here. The interesting thing is if you read the caveat at the top, it says an important caveat must be added to these figures. Quote, business contributions from individuals are based on the donor's occupation/employer. Since nearly everyone works for someone, and since the union affiliation does not list on FEC reports, totals for businesses are somewhat overstated, while labor is understated. I think that Citizens United is really just a club, and this is a pet peeve of mine I've had for a number of years. Citizens United is just a club used by typically Democrats to argue against, or to paint Republicans as being these big bad people in the pocket of corporations. But I actually don't think that major corporations, and I don't actually have the data at my fingertips to back this up, but I'm sure just a few minutes of enterprise and Google search will find it. That actually major corporations, the dollars that they're donating are very small, because even though Citizens United found a right for corporations to give money to political causes, it's not a very efficient use of a corporation's capital. And what I mean by that is it's an expenditure that the board has to account for, and the management has to account for to the shareholders. That's not an expense, right? It's non-deductible, and so they're paying taxes on those dollars, and they're having to. So it's you have to kind of stand up and say, hey, this is what I did, and you have to have a very good reason for that. So what's really more happening is actually wealthy people who own businesses and work in businesses, say the founders of Google or Mark Zuckerberg, right, are donating tens of millions of dollars to political causes, right? And a lot of that actually doesn't necessarily, I mean, a lot of it is targeted to fix the problems of their business. And a lot of it is because they have a specific worldview that they want to see propagated. And sometimes those things align and sometimes they don't. I mean, I read that Mark Zuckerberg spent, I don't remember the number of millions of dollars, but kind of doing get out the vote campaigns in Pennsylvania, specifically in Democrat strongholds, for example. Right. And so, I mean, that's and I think that he has a right to do that. I think that Citizens United is a kind of a good thing overall, unless, and what Robert Reich is kind of calling for is kind of public funding of elections, I think is the worst possible thing.
Really?
Yes, I think the public. I mean, I know that's what they do in Israel, and I think it's absolutely horrible. It keeps power in the hands of the powerful, and makes it impossible for people to break in, because the only way to get into a campaign like that is to 100% self-finance it. So it just is it's a mechanism for entrenching the entrenched interests. I think that public funding of elections is the worst political idea I've ever heard.
Because obviously having these giant corporate PACs and this pressure to raise millions of dollars obviously prevents anyone who's not conducive to the interests of those donating millions of dollars has a very hard time getting in the door. I mean, America. Well, can I stop you for a second? I apologize. I want to go a little deeper, kind of granularity. But let's try to find an example. Okay. Mm-hmm. So like, for the most part, what you're seeing businesses give money to places where they are typically ideologically aligned with. So it's not like Mark Zuckerberg is giving a donation to Joe Biden because he thinks Joe Biden is going to sneak some very Facebook specific thing into some legislation. Joe Biden's the wrong example. Like, let's say, pick a senator or a congressperson, right? And for some reason, I can't think of any off the top of my head right now, which is kind of funny for me. But let's say Zuckerberg gave to Senator Kamala Harris in her campaign, right? It wasn't like he was saying, "Hey, if he called her up and say, hey, I want you to put this piece of pork into this bill," she would probably say no. And the reason is because that stuff is too easily traceable. Now, he's giving money to her because they tend to be ideologically aligned, and the kind of things he's going to want, she's going to want. If that makes sense. Well, it does. I guess the problem that a lot of people would have with it is, like, what about the people whose interests are aligned with, like, homeless people? They tend not to have, millions of dollars to donate. And for all of the alleged bleeding heart, leftism of Silicon Valley types and certain other big donors, I'm not sure that they're actually credible as advocates for the homeless or for poor, former coal workers who are now all out of work. There's no money there. So the people who don't have money, in theory, democracy works because there's a lot more people without enough money to donate significantly than there are people with enough money to donate significantly. So in theory, although I have my doubts about the idealism of it, democracy is supposed to work by giving a voice to those who don't have the money to donate. Because if it's really all about the money, then why do we have a democracy at all? Why don't we just have an oligarchy and make it official?
So there's lots, but there's lots and lots of examples where money is not the be all end all of politics. Yes, it helps. And that's kind of what goes back to that thing I kind of mentioned from Dan Crenshaw before, is that he's like, hey, the only reason I need money is so I can get through to you and so you can hear my ideas so you can decide if you want to vote for me. At the end of the day, it's the voters that pull the lever. And there's lots and lots of examples where the candidate that spent the most money didn't win, not even by close. I mean, if money was everything in politics, Michael Bloomberg would have been the Democratic nominee. Hands down. Hands down. There's not even a question. And he couldn't get any traction, period.
That's true. I didn't say it was linear, but there is a sort of minimal buy-in. You can't get into the poker game unless you can buy in. You don't necessarily, once you have enough money to get your message out to some degree, then a lot of other factors take over, which also includes the incentives of the big media companies and how they're going to frame or give airtime to the different candidates, and who is the shareholders of CNN or MSNBC or Fox. I mean, Rupert Murdoch is notorious for his, influence on elections and electoral politics in a lot of different countries. Again, I'm not saying all of these things are right or wrong, but I think all of them indicate that corporations are in battles with each other, competitive battles with each other. If they're not in battles with each other, we should all actually be a little bit terrified, because that usually means there's a monopoly type thing going on or a barrier to entry type thing going on. But they're all in competition with each other, so then they're competing to support different candidates whose ideologies or voting patterns or pork aligns with their interests. But I feel like all of those are going in a certain set of directions that are usually opposed to the directions of people who don't have that kind of monetary power, and none of their interests directly align with any of the big corporate donation streams.
So, I mean, there certainly are issues, but I don't see how you get past them and all, and because I do believe that that everybody should have the right, that you have to figure out some way to finance elections, unless you say, hey, no, nobody can finance any elections, which then doesn't make any sense, because politicians do need to get out there and maybe even force them to just go meet their constituents face to face. But that makes it a lot harder to run nationwide campaigns. I mean, theoretically, a city council person can meet everybody in their district, and a congressional candidate can kind of touch a fair number of people. But you need it. The money is what they need to kind of get moving forward. And I don't see another way to kind of, and I guess I suppose there's lots of ways, but I don't.
Yeah, I mean, look, but there are two obvious ways that we used to have and we no longer have. One is, or they still have in some other countries. One is that news used to be a sort of guaranteed, free, non-monetized good for the public, that in exchange for use of the publicly provided airwaves and sort of channels that were available over various infrastructure, you had to have a half hour of public interest news. And it didn't necessarily have advertising. It wasn't supported by advertising. It was supported by the sort of larger licensing, that by giving networks the right to use these airwaves and make money on advertising the rest of the time, they had to have a half hour of public interest news with a firewall that they actually were supposed to be independent journalists. And that was about the news in general, journalism in general. And then I believe in Israel and some other countries, a certain amount of public airtime on the television stations is reserved equal time over certain thresholds for all the candidates for office for certain kinds of electoral politics. And they don't have to pay for it. It's free airtime equally to all the candidates. It doesn't necessarily mean there isn't donations and there isn't other ways for non-matching funds kind of thing to go on, but they at least have that as a baseline. And they also, at least in Israel and in most of Europe, they don't have two-party systems. So that also increases the sort of interest in there being multiple candidates whose voices you want to hear. And then there's sort of there's a whole ecosystem supporting the idea of like, hey, it's in the public interest for us all to be informed in an unbiased way or relatively unbiased, and B, for there to be a chance to hear all the candidates before they get filtered out by who garners millions of dollars of donations from the pharmaceutical industry, the insurance industry, the Silicon Valley industries, the coal mining industry. Like, before all those get involved, I want to know what these candidates have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose having a public square where candidates were given a good share of airtime for free would be not a horrible idea, although you'd have to force that on corporate interests. I think the bigger problem, I really do. I think money is a problem in politics, but I think the bigger problem with corporate power is actually is much bigger, and that is I don't know if you're familiar with a gentleman named Dr. Robert Epstein, and he did a whole project and a study, and I saw him on a congressional panel about 2 years ago, and he says that Google, and I just posting a link to an LA Times article, but you can find him in a lot of other places. But basically, he says that Google has the power to subtly shift people's votes just by the way they feed back search terms, and that that Google creates an ephemeral experience which is not trackable by the way they manipulate search terms, even with predictive text, and with just the way they answer you based on where you're at and how they think you lean. And that his view was that they could actually swing it several million votes on a national election scale just by playing with their search algorithm, which is to me that's the really scary thing about corporate power in politics. This guy started this whole project where he let people kind of download a software onto their computer, and it tracks what Google feeds them in search terms. And he actually found in Florida evidence of tampering in the run up to the 2020 election, which then he started to make a stink about it, and then Google stopped. There was a whole write up about it back in September, October. Interesting stuff and scary. That, to me, when you talk about power and politics and you talk about big tech, that's what's scary. It's that kind of stuff that's really scary.
I agree, actually, because both of these happened at to me, the scariest things that happened that were both mentioned in the article were, like you said, Google's sort of thumb on the scale with respect to searches about, things that in a sense, Google is, I think they have 80-90% plus of the search market globally, I believe. Like, they are information. It's them having an impartial algorithm is sort of critical for our sanity, because it's just like having a window on your house. If the window on your house has a filter that shuts out the frequencies of all I don't know, leopards or tanks or whatever, then you're not seeing the threats that are right outside your door, because they could be a leopard or a tank. I don't know. I mean, I'm exaggerating to make a point, but if Google is filtering and keeping us from seeing part of reality, we wouldn't realize that was even happening. And the other one was Amazon Web Services, which I believe is comparable. I don't think they're 90%, but I think they're well over 50% of the hosting of major internet activity. You kind of have to rent Amazon Web Services. They have petabytes more. Petabyte is like a gajillion petabytes of servers that are the backbone of the world. I mean, Cisco does the routers and the sort of in-between technology. But Amazon, because they were just scaling up so much, they wound up accidentally backing into this massive business in hosting everyone else's businesses, everyone else's online platforms. And so Parler, or Parlay, I guess it's Parlay because that's the French word. There was always a sort of libertarian pushback to the idea that Facebook and Twitter and stuff should be publicly ruled, meaning like what if conservatives complained that they couldn't get their voices across on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, the pushback was always, well, go start your own platform. It's private. Start your own private platform. And yet when they did with Parlay, Google
got shut down.
Yeah, Google and Apple took them off their Play stores and Apple stores on the phones, which means you can't even get it on your phone. And then Amazon said they wouldn't even host them on Amazon Web Services. So it was, it is kind of funny, but it's like, oh, I guess we can't start our own platform because you don't want us to. That should be seen as horribly monopolistic, but somehow it's something that all these, allegedly left-leaning liberal people are cheering corporate monopoly behavior. And I'm like, where did your brain stop working? I don't get it. What happened? That's not good. Don't do that. No. Stop.
Well, the problem is when you can tell when you're talking to somebody who's being real and realistic when they're willing to take a stand against something when it runs in their own favor. And that the cheering, it's outcome based, right? Meaning if they were taking down, if AWS decided to take down a left-wing platform, right? These same people would not be cheering. They'd be outraged. And you have to always kind of be able to walk between the double standards and try to make sure, examine oneself and make sure you yourself are not subject to some kind of double standard, because that's something that happens all the time in politics. It's a very big thing and it's very, very big in politics. One of my favorite examples was when the Biden rule, which was when McConnell refused to hold hearings to seat Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court. There was a clip circulating of Joe Biden at the tail end of, I think, George W. Bush's term, where he was on the floor of the Senate saying, if there becomes a vacancy on the Supreme Court in this election year, there's no way the right thing to do would be wait till after the election. And that was Joe Biden on the floor of the Senate. And then McConnell's doing it, and everybody's like, oh, you can't do that. But Biden himself is out there in outrage. And a lot of the things that happen in our country are kind of these political red-blue games, which are really kind of antithetical to what kind of the people want and need. But it is kind of these are the things that the people in power do to kind of keep power.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of where we're getting to is, like, Biden has a long history of hypocrisy. He was one of the nastiest people to Anita Hill during Clarence Thomas's confirmation hearings. There's, I think the reason I liked this article was that it reminded us that we have this sort of kleptocratic class / cooperative largely cooperative relationship between the big corporations and our so-called elected leaders that is sort of fundamentally undemocratic. I'm not sure I'm in favor of democracy the way it's been working, which is a much bigger conversation. But if we're going to pretend that we have democracy, these sorts of behaviors and these sorts of relationships and these sorts of barriers to entry to anyone who has something genuinely non-official red line, non-official blue line to say or to propose, I think we're producing, I'm expecting the next few months to be like a real widespread shift among, the former Trump voters into thinking that it's no longer that they lost an election, it's that they lost America. I'm afraid that they're going to say that, Washington is a dictatorship. They have no chance. They have no hope. They can't even complain about it on Facebook. They can't even complain about it on Twitter anymore. They're shut out. And I just can't see that being a positive direction for America to go. Because even if it's only 30% of Trump voters who feel that way, they probably have 70% of America's guns, I'm suspecting.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I think the bigger issue is that, you're right that I don't know if it comes down to guns, but I don't think we want to live in a society where large swaths of the population are disillusioned with our political system. And I think that if you go back to the core and the foundation of our political system, back to all the way to the founding fathers, and look at kind of the system that they set up, I think it's a great system. As far as systems go, I mean, I have some kind of generally suspect about the long-term feasibility of systems, and the systems need mechanisms to self kind of modulate over time. And I think that the founding fathers did a relatively brilliant job of setting up a good system in that way, and that we need to move back towards that system rather than away from it. Which is why I think Dan, for example, back a little bit back to the election controversy, Dan Crenshaw put out an over an hour podcast in which he also hosted Trey Gowdy, and they were talking about how that this whole idea of this that there could have been a real challenge to the election on January 6th is just BS, and it is nowhere to be found in the Constitution. And they brought their legal constitutional arguments about it. And of course, there are other constitutional arguments from the other side. And as long as you're kind of sticking with the base system, I think actually it's a good system. The problem is when people are completely disillusioned. And I think that we need to, as a society, step up and say, hey, first of all, the biggest problem in our society today from a political standpoint is that most people are stuck in the red-blue dichotomy, right? And it's kind of odd that I live in a world where I agree more with the things that I hear from people that are, very liberal, your kind of Brett and Eric Weinsteins, et cetera. And there's a number of other names on there.
Glenn Greenwald, yeah.
Glenn Greenwald. These people are saying things that they're speaking truth in a lot of ways, and sometimes there are flaws in their arguments. I disagree with them. I mean, obviously, I don't get to have face-to-face conversations with them, but I hear their arguments, and I have kind of points or counterpoints that I think are different. But at the end of the day, getting above that red-blue kind of divide is important. At the end of the day, I don't know how do you fix that going forward in the long term, because even I still am going to vote pretty much down ticket Republican next time I get a ballot. And that's because I don't see any real credible people on the Democrat team. I mean, I'd vote for an independent that said a lot of, important things, things that made a lot of sense, possibly for president. My presidential vote doesn't matter anyway, because I live in a blue state that has not shifted its, side and since Ronald Reagan. So, and even that was only very temporary because he was a California boy. But so it's just we got to get past that and figure out a way out of that kind of vicious loop, because the hypocrisy that kind of goes around with politics and that's. Sorry, I know I've been rambling. I apologize.
Yeah, no, it's okay, because part of getting out of that red-blue dichotomy is realizing that if you disagree with something that's common on the left, it does not make you a right-winger. If you disagree with something that's common on the right, it does not make you a left-winger. It doesn't make you a Democrat. And there's this sort of knee-jerk reaction in so many conversations that, oh, well, if you questioned the way that Biden did X, that means you're a Trump evil person. And if you question the way that, what's his name, Joe whatever, supported the election lawsuit, that means you're a Democratic Socialist for America. It's like this binary thing is just, it doesn't match reality, and it's impoverishing. This is worse than even the words thing. I mean, you and I came together over the realization that using words differently was crippling our ability to understand each other. But this sort of binary thing where anybody who says anything even someone far left like Brett Weinstein, simply by questioning the part of wokeism that literally mobbed him out of his home and job and everything, even questioning that at all makes him alt-right. And I gather that, for any Republican like David Frum or whoever who questioned, Trump's foreign policy, they call him a rhino, a Republican in name only, and, tar and feather him out of town. So I don't know that we need better words actually to describe that dynamic and say, hey, whatever policies we want, whatever voting thing we see in the future, can we get away from treating each other as enemies? That's what I'm terrified. And actually, going back to the sort of starting point of our discussion, I feel like a lot of the partisanship is almost explicitly to distract us from paying attention to all the legislation, all the bills, all of the liquidity that's given to corporations and interest-free loans from the bank and like whatever, that they get all these sweet deals while we're still all arguing about whether somebody said something that might have been a little bit supportive of the Capitol people.
Yeah. That's I can't disagree with any of that. I think that's a big part of, it's certainly, look, it's way easier to divide us as people than to focus on uniting us. And the red team and the blue team and I think that they really should just be called teams, have figured out that by dividing us into different, teams, sports teams, like I have a friend who's a sports fan. I don't really do much in the sports ball kind of arena, but I had some like offer for some like tickets to, I think, a Clipper game or something like that. In LA, we have two basketball teams, the Lakers and the Clippers. And I don't really know much the difference between them, but I have a friend who's like really, really into sports all the time, right? And I had this opportunity to get like some like court level seats like for really cheap price to a Clipper game. I'm like, I don't really care to go to a basketball game. I've been to a few here and there, but like it's not really something that
I would have taken them. I love basketball.
Well, if you were here, great, I would have gladly offered them to you. But I call them up and I'm like, hey, I have this opportunity to get these like fourth row back, center court seats, right, to this Clippers game. And he's like, I'm a Laker fan. I was like, okay. Like, I mean, when I get to the extent I go to sports games, right? The extent I go to sports games, I just go because I like to watch the kind of the physical prowess that takes place on the field. I particularly like watching football because I think it's kind of interesting and you can see the strategy and you can see all that stuff. But I'm very agnostic as to what team wins or loses because I don't really follow it. But what our politics have done is they've come to this conclusion where they've figured out that if all we have to do is get Americans to think of politics like they think of sports, right, then they only ever have to make one decision, and that's which team do you support? Do you support the red team or the blue team? And when everybody's divided like that, they don't have to focus on policy. The majority of Americans agree, and like you look at studies, and they run polls on all this stuff, and a lot of it depends on the way they word the questions. But like you take immigration, for example, most people believe that immigration, that we should do something to solve the problem of those people that are here, but we need to, have a secure border at the same time, right? Most people agree to that. It's common sense, right? But there's no
party option for that. And
there's not one honest broker in all of Washington for any of that.
Right. And most Americans totally agree that we shouldn't be poisoning the air. We shouldn't be putting poison into the land. We shouldn't be poisoning the water. We shouldn't be polluting. And yet, because of the climate change partisan team thing, we can't to agree on what to do to limit pollution, even though we almost all agree that, like, hey, putting stuff that I can't breathe into the air that I need to breathe is a bad idea.
Yeah.
So it's like, this is, it's very dangerous. I think in Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, it's a wonderful book. The Emperor Justinian was.
I believe through it.
I don't think I ever made it through the entire thing, but I read a lot of it. In Emperor Justinian's time in Byzantium, sports teams had become aligned with political factions and with colors. So there actually was, I think, 5 factions, and they had the green team, the orange team, the red team, the blue team, whoever they were. But they were also associated with political factions in whatever kind of equivalent. I think they might have even called it the Senate, because it was the Roman Empire. It was the Eastern Roman Empire. And the partisanship got so bad that at some point Justinian finally had it that the entire, whatever team was his biggest enemy, they came into a stadium, just like our stadium, 60,000 people in a stadium. And he surrounded the stadium with centurion troops, and then he massacred them all. And that was the end of that partisan discussion.
I don't think that's a good solution to American political problems, by the way. But although watching news in the last 2 weeks leads me to believe that many people of the left do believe that's a great way to solve our political problems.
That's what I'm saying. It's like they seem to want that. And I'm like, do you really think Trump voters are like your enemy? And like, I wouldn't have voted for Trump. I was a Bernie supporter, but like, don't be talking about them like they're Al-Qaeda. Like, I literally had like a conversation with one of my family members, and he was saying, well, we don't allow Al-Qaeda on Facebook either. And I was like, are you saying that like Trump voters who are being kicked off Facebook are like Al-Qaeda? Like, can you play that sentence back for yourself and tell me that you agree with it? And a lot of them seem to. They seem to believe that. And this is way beyond like words. Like, this is scaring me.
Yeah. So to bring it kind of back around, because we're here to talk about corporations and the issues of corporations. And I know we spent a lot of time talking about the money in politics. And I think that, I told you, I think that's a sideshow. Honestly, I really do think it's a sideshow. And I think that the proof that it's a sideshow is the way it flows back and forth, right? Sometimes the business money flows to the red team, and sometimes it flows to the blue team. And the real issue at the end of the day is when you have corporations that have actual power over people's hearts and minds, like that thing I told you about Facebook, which I posted the article, and there's lots more on that guy. That guy is like intense, and he's got a lot of stuff to say, and he's done the work. Robert Epstein, or the fact that the media seems to have completely also chosen sides. Right? You have red team media and blue team media, and the facts they report to the people that consume those media sources are. We had some feedback going on. Oh, fixed.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem. And so, and the fact that you have a red team media and a blue team media, and obviously all media is always going to have a bias, but like it's gone way too far, and that's where I think that corporate power is problematic. That's where their issues are. It's when Twitter has the right to boot somebody off of their platform, and of course they have a right. But I think that there's going to be some interesting case law coming out. I hope that there'll be some interesting cases coming out, because there were some cases back in, I don't remember exactly when. I actually looked it up recently, but there was a case where there was a corporation that owned a town, right?
Yeah.
And they tried to stop some religious group from distributing flyers in the town. And it was a First Amendment case that kind of came down to, even though you own the town, like there is still this thing called a public square. And I think that that's the right frame to look at these tech giants, Facebooks and Twitters of the world. I think that we need some solid First Amendment law to come down, and preferably legislation. But I don't get a lot of hope for legislation. But at least even the current laws can be interpreted based on that precedent to find that those platforms need to provide that space.
Right, but I don't think they will. But for the same reason, Brett Weinstein has been talking about journalism has a business model to foment partisanship because it's good for ratings. That's not a secret. But I don't think we ever thought that it would take over journalism to the extent that it has. But he took it further and said that the business model of the two parties is to foment this this sort of partisan ridiculousness, while they agree on most of the major issues of monetary policy and how to regulate the whichever industry, whether it's oil and gas or Silicon Valley or whatever. There might be a symbolic thing every once in a while, like, Biden shutting down the North Dakota pipeline, or Trump threatening something with respect to social media. But I think those are mostly symbolic. I think by and large, the two major parties agree on 90% of the things that we really would be discussing if we actually had an open discussion democracy. So the business model is working really well. I think this is where it comes back to this article, is that the corporations are doing great. Actual competition is not doing well, because when you have really big corporations doing really well, they can, if they're working well in a nice, happy, corrupt way with the business model of the two parties, they can do something like completely shut a major competitor down. Like Parler is, in theory, a major upstart competitor to Facebook and Twitter. It's saying, that's explicitly what it is. Here's a major social media discussion forum for people who are sick of Facebook and Twitter. And they are shutting it down. They're doing it in the name of helping the partisan war, but they're actually doing it because it's good for their business model. I have no doubt that the major calculation for Google and Apple to take it off their Play stores and for Amazon to kick it off their servers is because they perceive it as good for business. And that's scary. That's scary to me. If there's anything government should be doing, it's making it safe for competition.
Yes. Well, actually, the interesting thing is, I was going to break in earlier with this, but Parler filed a number of lawsuits after they were taken down against Amazon specifically. One was for breach of contract because they didn't give notice that they were going to take them down, and they were supposed to give 30 days, and they gave less than 30 hours. But the more interesting one was they filed an antitrust case because they said that Amazon AWS also hosts Twitter, and that Amazon was doing the bidding basically of these other social media platforms in trying to stamp out competition. And so I think that's going to be very interesting. I don't know if that's going to actually get quickly settled, and it's going to depend on whether the founders of Parler are more interested in a payday or interested in the precedent, and we'll find out. And the case I referenced earlier about the town is Marsh versus Alabama, and I just posted a link to an article about it if people are interested. But
because there used to be a time, and you could argue about how long ago it was, when, the Republican Party was, I think, really the first big trust busting party. That was Teddy Roosevelt's, one of his, lasting claims to fame was that he broke up some of the big monopolies. And then when Wilson took over, I think that sort of progressive idea of busting up companies became a little bit more of a Democratic thing. But I think one of the things that endangered our entire political system of checks and balances is when Clinton moved the Democratic Party rightward and became a sort of pro-business, pro-Wall Street party. The 1996 Telecommunications Act allowed for a tremendous amount more mergers. Also in that period, the repeal of Glass-Steagall allowed banks to do mergers. Neither party is a trust-busting party. Neither party has done anything really significant in at least 25 years to question the growing mergers and monopolies in the industries that control our lives. And so Parler should be a good chance of that. But if neither party is going to, if neither team is going to help the idea of competition against big monopolies, then big monopolies are going to win. I mean,
so we are butting up against the kind of the end of our. We we try to keep these to about an hour. So we're butting up kind of against the end of that. But I think it is important to recognize the place of each part of government in each of these things. And so the Parler thing that I mentioned is interesting because that is taking the existing laws that are on the books and use that as a framework of precedent to say that the law already supports this. Specifically, I think that March versus Alabama case is very interesting because Twitter is there is no public square, especially in the middle of a pandemic when people are being forced indoors, right? The social media giants of today are the public square, and they should be required to allow free speech on their platforms. And that we can probably go hours on this specific topic, but that's one area. Another area is the legislature, right? Meaning the court's job is only to interpret the law, right?
Mm-hmm.
The lawmakers can get together and fix this problem also. I don't think they will, right? Because they're too busy in the red-blue dynamic and benefiting for it. And at the moment, it's going to suit the red team a lot to cry foul about this stuff, but the blue team is rolling in the dough from the corporate interests, so they're gonna fight against it. And so there's a problem. And then obviously you have the executive as kind of a place in there as what has some power in there, especially given the kind of the regulatory state, the FCC and the FTC as arbiters that are parts of the executive branch that's the Federal Communications Commission and the Federal Trade Commission for those following at home. And they have some of the authority to regulate a lot of these areas. And I'm generally anti-regulation. And I think that anything that anybody tries to do on this front from a regulatory standpoint is going to be overreach, because I think almost all regulation is overreach. But
we disagree about it. Well, you just are sort of agreeing with me, though, because what is breaking up monopolies if not regulation? You agree that certain regulation is necessary to keep competition intact.
Sure. I look, I'm not an absolutist in any sense of the word. So overall, in general, like I said, I think most regulation is overreach, right? Obviously, we need some regulation, right? But some regulations need to exist. But I think and this is a whole nother conversation about what parts of government belong in what parts of society, and what their base functions are. And the regulatory state is a major problem, because what's happened is over the last number of decades, the legislature has delegated its authority and its responsibility to the regulatory state to make and implement decisions. When it's supposed to be the legislature, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why I actually think that money in politics is not the problem you think it is, because most of the minutia, most of those areas where one company is advantaged over another company happens at the regulatory level and not at the legislative level, because Congress writes a bill and the bill is 2,000 pages long. Nobody's ever read it. And all that bill really does is empower regulators to make decisions. That's what, most legislation, that's all it does. It's just empower regulators. And I think it's a huge problem in our society. And you're not even going to get to being able to fix it until we can get past this red team, blue team dichotomy. I mean, there's a lot of things that we can do to clean this crap up in this country. But until people are willing to rise above the red team, blue team dichotomy, you're not gonna get there. And the next challenge, once you get a critical mass of people to rise above red team, blue team dichotomy, is to have them exert their political voices on their representatives. And that starts at the very local level, and it takes years and years and years to percolate. Oh, that's my soapbox.
Well, can we wrap this up with anything more optimistic? Because I'm trying to be optimistic, and I feel like the same thing that makes a lot of people a lot of my friends are so relieved. They were crying on the day of inauguration. They're so happy that the Democrats won, and that they won the Senate, and that sanity will be restored to the land. And I wanted the Democrats to win, but I didn't want this. I didn't want this cheerleading to see, every Trump supporter be treated as an enemy. I see this as a defeat for the unity of the country rather than a victory. And I'm trying to be optimistic, but right now I'm not optimistic. And I'm trying to find something to feel more optimistic about.
So I'm gonna go two directions with that, and the first one's gonna sound more pessimistic than optimistic. And I wrote a post on Facebook probably 4 years ago. I could probably go and find it. And basically, what I was suggesting was to Democrats or anti-Trumpists who were hysterical in the early days of when Trump was elected, and I pointed out to them that they should recognize the feeling that they have today, because there are a lot of people who disagree with them politically who felt the same way for 8 years under Obama, and that that they lost, and that a lot of the things that they held dear were being trampled, and that people should show more grace and magnanimity in the way they conduct each other with each other, and discourse with each other on things, and recognize that that's just a little more empathy, basically, and recognize that the people that you perceive as your political enemy are really your fellow neighbors and countrymen, and let's kind of move on from that. But from an optimistic perspective, I think that um, it looks like a very large, long road ahead. But I think that you mentioned before the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, that took over 200 years. So we have time.
Depending on, I think Gibbons says it takes 1,000 years.
All right, I apologize. I never, like I said, I only leaf through it, but it took hundreds of years for that to happen, and so even if you follow the kind of the Eric Weinstein view that America peaked somewhere in the 70s, we still have we have a very, I believe, very robust foundation, fundamental kind of system that works and has worked and worked for hundreds of years, and actually steered us through a civil war successfully. Right? Like literally people were killing each other. And so we can rise above this. We do have the ability to get there. We need to double down on our institutions, come together as people, as American citizens, as people, as brothers, as neighbors, and decide that we want better. And I think that more and more people are starting to wake up and see this. More and more people are realizing that the red-blue thing is just a distraction to divide us, and that we can be united, and unity is a choice. And I heard an interesting thought about unity. Like, that the unity message is powerful because Biden tried to co-opt it.
Yeah.
Right. Meaning there is something latent in the populace that recognizes that unity is something that's necessary. And the sign for this is that Biden picked it up and said, "Hey, yeah, look at this unity thing. We're going to pitch it now." Obviously, that's too harsh. Many people would look at Biden's actions in his first days in office and ask where the unity is outside of lip service. But that said, the fact that the message was successful and resonated with the populace should be cause for optimism. But we need to pick it up. We, the people, need to pick it up and carry it forward, and not allow the kleptocrats, the red team and the blue team, to divide us. We choose that.
Right. I mean, it's that klepto part of it that I'm afraid is still deranging all of us. I'm afraid that as long as there's a perception, which is partly true, that there's a sort of inside and outside, and the people who are inside those elite circles are enriching themselves, and the rest of us are really on the outside, and the decisions that decide how to allocate wealth are being made in those inside circles, and the rest of us are outside of it, which includes the corporations, and it includes the too big to fail banks that make sure they give big enough donations that it acts as an insurance policy, and they get bailed out when they lose trillions of dollars, and the rest of us are left out of that. So I think until they address that, I think the climate of deep distrust in our institutions is going to continue. And I hope that it gets fixed by, as you say, functioning of the accountability of our institutions, rather than a Chinese style, revolution or guillotines or something, which one way or another, if you keep treating your fellow citizens as an enemy, eventually somebody's going to start shooting. And I'm hoping, that gives me a little bit of optimism, I guess, that there is a little bit of symbolic attempts towards unity. And but I think, like you're saying, though, it's really about everybody individually on their street, in their Facebook friends, in their whatever, starting to reach back out to the people they had been so passionately disagreeing, and not reaching out as like condescending, but as like, hey, you're still part of us. So yes,
give them this book. It is a lighthearted attempt to show everybody that we really mostly agree on most things, because and we're allowing our words to divide us. So without further, it seems like a good place to end. Thank you for watching, and feel free to reach out in your comments if you think we said something that was completely off base, or share with us interesting articles and stories you think we ought to comment about. And I think, Matthew, you and I should probably look to do something on corporate bailouts, because I think we have some disagreement there and perspective, and I think we can have an interesting conversation about it.
Awesome.
Have a great day.
Happy